All right, well, good morning. We had some technical limitations today at church. The live stream didn't work for either Sunday school or um, or the actual service. So uh, I've decided to just make an audio recording of the class so that we can have something to go with for those of you who were not able to be at church this morning. And, there was there for a while, they might still make it. The Captain Crunch cereal every now and again does um, does a version of their cereal with only berries called Oops All Berries. So this is the Oops Only audio version for the recording this morning. So if you've pulled the worksheet off CCB, you'll see that this week we are making the case for Christianity. And I have a passage of scripture up at the top there. Matthew 10:16 says, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And Greg Kokel has an application point of the text that basically he's saying when we are having these apologetics type conversations, we can apply that by saying we're wise in how we do our maneuvering conversationally, but we are innocent in how we present it. We're not offensive in how we present things. Excuse me. And then there's a big block of text there. And this is just to make a note about apologetic methodology. When you get into studying apologetics, you will hear the names of different schools of thought on how to do apologetics. And there are some schools, the evidential and classical schools, which they stress the truth about what can be known about God via the created universe and logical arguments. And the critique of that is, well, you end up putting God in the dock, so to speak. You give the unbeliever the role of judge, and he then is able to judge God himself to the unbeliever's standard to see whether or not he measures up. And so then the other major school is presuppositional apologetics, and they stress the truth that that men, as we know biblically, suppress the truth in their unrighteousness. And so they say, look, you guys are out there trying to throw out evidence and arguments, and in reality, they're just going to keep suppressing it over and over and over again. And then the critique of them is, well, look, you're just you're just throwing Bible at them until they repent, and that's not going to work. You're not going to make connections. There's no point of contact between the believer and the unbeliever. And obviously, that's a really simplified version of all of those camps. But, biblically, I believe that, yes, people have bias and their presuppositions and their worldview, but I don't think the Bible describes us as just kind of having this, if you would imagine a fishbowl over your head, and that's your beliefs, and nothing can get in or out because you just are locked into this. I don't think that's exactly the way of doing it. And Francis Schaeffer, he took some classes from Cornelius Van Til. If you're familiar with that name, he was kind of the father of presuppositional apologetics. So he gets that, but he felt that the point of contact is where the unbeliever is inconsistent. Their worldview, because it's not based, as we've talked about, It's not based on God's truth. It's they've made some idol out of something. And because of that, something doesn't fit in the box. And so he said the point of contact between the believer and the unbeliever is right where their worldview ends up clashing with God's reality. And Nancy Pearcey, the author of the book we're using, she spent some time at L'Abri with Francis and Edith Schaeffer and adopted their approach. And the good thing about this particular method is that it's very adaptable, kind of like we've been talking. It allows you to tailor your approach to each individual. And hopefully, Nathan and I, we hope that this is helping you to think apologetically. If you remember several weeks ago now, Chase wrapped up a series about thinking Christianly. And this is kind of in that same vein, because he did answer specific issues, but he wanted to try and get you to be able to kind of think through things, so when the next issue comes through, you can think through it from a Christian biblical perspective. And that's the kind of approach that we decided to take, because there's a way of doing apologetics where you can just say, look, here's this book that has 10 hard pressing questions, and and then gives you answers to it, and then you move on. And there's value there because you're getting answers. But the problem becomes, well, what happens when you have the 11th question and the 12th question? This, what we are trying to do is, again, trying to get you to think apologetically, and hopefully some of this is kind of starting to stick for you. Lord willing, when you have conversations with friends and coworkers and whatever, that some of this stuff is coming to your mind. You're like, aha, I can at least take one step or whatever in learning this, and it's helpful and adaptable, the method we're going with, because as you answer questions, you're not simply answering questions, you're answering questioners. And that's a line I took from the late Ravi Zacharias, but the point is that you're wanting to try and get behind the issue to the person, right? Because ultimately we want the person to come to Christ. So maybe they're using objections to Christianity as a smokescreen of sorts. Like, maybe they have actual objections. Maybe that is the reason they're not convinced of Christianity, is this problem. And that's fine. There are people like that. But other times there'll be someone that maybe got burned by the church or got hurt by a Christian, and they are using these arguments or whatever as kind of a cloak for their pain. And so always keep in mind that you're shooting for the heart of the questioner, and you're not just answering questions and moving on. And next we've got laid out all 5 principles there. Week 1, we'll say, principle 1, identifying the idol, and we paired that with the first step of the Columbo tactic in gathering information with questions. And then step 2, identifying the idol's reductionism. And step 3, testing the idol with correspondence. And principle 4, testing the idol, again, with coherence. And then we threw in Columbo step 2, reversing the burden of proof. And then finally, this week, we're replacing the idol, making the case for Christianity. And we're going to be pairing that with Columbo step 3, using questions to make a point. Now, when we're replacing the idol-based worldviews, this is where your work in gathering information and identifying what's sticking out of the box pays off. Because what you're doing as you've been gathering information and asking questions, you're finding out what this person believes and why they believe it. And in the process, you've seen where their worldview doesn't take everything into account, and they've reduced certain things. And what this does is it shows you, kind of gives you a target for how to direct the conversation. And I've got a quote there from Nancy Pearcey that sums that up. She says, when we get started, or we can get started by identifying those elements that people smuggle in from a Christian worldview. They are showing us where their own worldview breaks down, and at the same time, what they find most appealing about Christianity. These provide strategic starting points for framing a biblical worldview attuned to the questions of our day. And that's exactly right. We've learned a couple of in the last few weeks that the things that don't fit in the box of unbelieving, idol-based worldviews, those things are, they try and explain them away, right? We talked about how you've got that upper-lower story divide going on, and some people who live in the lower story, well, anything they can't explain, they throw into the upper story, and it says that's an illusion, a fiction, blah, blah, blah. Or if they're living in the upper story and they just say, well, the lower story is all just determined, right? Determined by whatever your culture, whatever your gender, your whatever, any socioeconomic group there is, that's what that is. It's not real. But ultimately, we've learned also that they have to they have to act as if certain things are true. And so what you're doing is you're finding what they value and how they borrow from Christianity, with usually without even knowing it, right? So then we are able to tailor our approach to demonstrate how Christianity takes everything into consideration. And I took the next several blocks mostly straight from Pearcey's book. She said, in dealing with materialism, or naturalism, atheism, however you want to word that, she said, to counter materialism, we can show that a biblical worldview teaches an even greater respect for the material world. The physical universe is not just a product of chance. The earth is not a rock spinning through empty space with no higher purpose or meaning. Instead, the physical universe was brought into being by a God of love and beauty. It is a product of plan and design. It teaches that there is only one God and that He created matter. God Himself took on a physical body. He was not an avatar who just appeared to be human. He actually became human. The incarnation grants an astonishingly high dignity to the material world. Instead, and she contrasts that there with a sort of, well, maybe matter's bad, and once you die, the heaven is going to be just this realm of spirit and mind or something. And in contrast, they said, instead He is going to replace it with a new creation, and we will have new physical bodies. Christianity imparts greater value to the material realm than any version of materialism. So let's look into that a little bit. On naturalism, the universe is just kind of there, right? There is nothing particularly special about Earth or about our universe because it's just a product of chance, right? The Earth is just a rock spinning through space. There is no meaning. There is no purpose. We had talked a while ago how materialists and atheists will say it's just blind, pitiless indifference, right? Any meaning or purpose we have attached to ourselves and our lives and the earth or whatever is just an illusion that we just kind of force on ourselves to get through. um, to get through life. And that's not at all true, right? Um, Christianity says there is meaning and purpose. And as humans, we crave meaning and purpose, so that helps us. That gives us a starting point. Now, she also mentioned that God himself took on a physical body, and he was not just an avatar who appeared to be human. And that is kind of a reference to Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism and stuff, uh, that essentially say, well, when God appears, it's not an actual physical body. It's just or it's not actually human. It's just an avatar. It appears to be human. It's really not. And we're saying no. God actually did become human. It's real. And um, the new creation is not just spiritual or mental or whatever. It's physical. When God created originally, he said it was good, and there will be a new creation, and we will have new physical bodies. So it has a much higher value of matter and the material physical world that materialism wants to stress, without having the issues that materialism brings along with it. And similarly, she says to counter empiricism, Christians can show that a biblical worldview offers a better basis for trusting our senses. The only adequate basis for confidence in sensory knowledge is the biblical teaching that a creator designed our sensory apparatus to function reliably in the world he created. The doctrine of creation is the epistemological guarantee. Remember, epistemology is just how you know stuff. The doctrine of creation is the epistemological guarantee that the constitution of our human faculties conforms to the structure of the external world. Christianity places a high value on empirical knowledge as one of the crucial preconditions for the rise of modern science. Christians believed there was an orderly universe to be discovered, and that they were discovering how God reveals himself in nature. They believed they were thinking God's thoughts after him. So we can dig into that a little bit. We've talked in previous weeks about how being made in the image of God, and God being a God of order and of logic, and it gives us a helpful foundation. We know that the scriptures teach us that some of God's invisible attributes are made plain to us based on what we would call general revelation, what the created order. And so it's an important point that Christianity, she's saying here, gave rise to modern science, because the early scientists, who also a good number of them happened to be Christian, they believed that, well, the scriptures told them attributes of God are clearly perceived in nature. They believed that because God is a God of truth and goodness and order, he will not just create senseless chaos. And they believe that because he made us in his image, we are reasonable. We are reasonable creatures. So therefore, they can go out and discover what and how God reveals certain aspects of himself in creation. And something that's really interesting is there were certain cultures, let's say China and Egypt, to name a couple, they were more advanced than the kind of European cultures in which we think of that gave rise to modern science. And so even though some of these cultures were more advanced, modern science did not rise out of them. Why not? It's an interesting question, right? Well, part of the reason, I would say, is if you look at China, the prevailing worldview would tell you that ultimately, um, there's not this God with attributes you can discover in nature. In fact, the physical is not good, and the ultimate goal for you is to realize that everything is actually one. God and everything else is one, and so you have to come to this conclusion that you aren't your own individual. You need to become one with everything else. So why would you bother to go try and discover something about what God reveals in nature if that's your view of how things are? Um, so it's important that the rise of science and the preconditions for science can be defended by Christianity. And similarly, to counter rationalism, we can show that Christianity honors human rationality as part of the image of God. Christianity stands for a unified, logically coherent truth against the upper-lower story divide that fragments modern worldviews. Christianity also stands against the tradition of being suspicious and debunking every truth claim. If you remember the whole, well, you only believe that because blank. Or all truth claims are really just blank. Like that sort of thing. And biblically, we have God that in Isaiah 1:18 invites us to reason together. In Romans 12:2, Paul talks that sanctification comes through the renewal of our minds. And we learn in Matthew 22:37 that the goal is to learn to love God with all our mind. And interestingly, the word logic comes from the Greek word logos, the word used to describe Jesus in John 1:1. Right, so the Greek enarchein halagos, right, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we know biblically that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's Jesus, right? It's from the same Greek word that we get logic from. The implication then is that logic reflects the nature of God's own mind and character. We can ground logic and the reasoning process without making it an idol, without making it ultimate, and thereby suffering the consequences of that sort of view. We can account for this, and we can affirm the truth of that without taking on the weaknesses. And finally, with postmodernism, Christianity offers an even more radical insight into the contingency of human knowledge. Postmodernism reduces knowledge claims to expressions of interest and power based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity. And we want to say, there is some truth to that, right? There are certain things which are contingent upon various socioeconomic factors and various cultural forces, but that isn't the ultimate. That isn't as deep as you go. The biblical teaching on idols, as she writes, cuts much deeper to the ultimate spiritual commitments at the core of human motivation. The Bible teaches that the overriding factor in the choices we make is our commitment to a concept of the divine. Our lives are shaped by the God we worship, whether the God of the Bible or some other substitute deity. And so in every area, Christianity encompasses the valid insights of all other worldviews while avoiding their weaknesses. And then, this is kind of the important point here, is that logic and the reasoning process, the orderliness of the universe, the reliability of our senses, an accurate understanding of the human condition, and a grounding for objective morality are all foundational principles or presuppositions upon which other arguments and beliefs can be built, and only the Christian worldview can make sense of these foundations. The strong moral motions people have, and that our society is based on, come from Christianity. Now, I've got a couple of quotes here. One of them is from Alexa to Tocqueville, and they wrote Democracy in America. Excellent book, very politically insightful. But they write, the most powerful or the most profound geniuses of Rome and Greece never came up with the idea of equal rights. Jesus Christ had to come to earth to make it understood that all members of the human species are naturally alike and equal. And so that's a positive version, right? They're praising that. The other side of the coin then is from Friedrich Nietzsche, who said, another Christian concept has passed even more deeply into the tissue of modernity, the concept of the equality of souls before God. This concept furnishes the prototype of all theories of equal rights. Now, he's lamenting this. He would ultimately say you have to get rid of that because that's part of the slave morality and it hinders your will to power. But they both acknowledge that any idea of universal equality of human rights is based in Christianity and the idea that we are all made in the image of God. And then another quote down there from a more modern atheist philosopher, Richard Rorty. He's reflecting on the fact that evolution cannot give universal human rights, and he says the concept came from religious claims that human beings are made in the image of God. This Jewish and Christian element in our tradition is gratefully invoked by freeloading atheists like myself. Now, he's honest about that, but you have to think, you can't account for it, and so it definitely needs to be stressed. Like, no, you don't have any right to that. That came from Christianity, and your view can't accept it. You need to acknowledge that you are living with a contradiction, if you will. And all of that takes us to Apologetics Plinko. This is going to be way harder to, well, maybe not way harder. It's going to be a little harder to do without, with only audio, but you get the point. You've all seen Plinko in action, and basically, I was like, is it The Price is Right? That's what it is. Price is Right. Goodness. So anyway, you've seen it. It's a bunch of pegs up there you can drop your little disc into, and it kind of goes around left and right as it goes down the board, and eventually it falls into an area along the bottom that has different money values or a bankrupt or whatever. Well, in the sense that I'm envisioning this, the bottom area has essentially three categories. One category is logic, one category is science, and one category is morality. And we've kind of covered how Christianity makes sense of logic and the reasoning process, and it makes sense of the in the science category, it makes sense of the orderliness of the universe, the reliability of our senses, the design of things, and then ultimately the morality category. And so here's how I view this working. Someone comes up to you at the top of the Plinko board with an objection. They say, look, you Christians believe in the Trinity, right? Well, I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in the Trinity because it's a contradiction. You're saying God is one and God is three. That doesn't work. So I'm not a Christian. Now, if you recall from last week, if someone says, if someone uses the word contradiction, it should kind of perk your ears up a little bit. Be like, well, wait a minute. Do you actually mean a contradiction, or do you mean something else? And if you understand the Trinity, and as believers we should, in fact, there's a discipleship class on the Trinity and the doctrine of God that comes up every now and again. So when you see that next on the list, make sure to take it. But you'll say, well, hold on. Uh, in Mr. Objector, in the example you're using, you're missing something. We don't say that God is one in the same way that God is three. That would be a contradiction. If we said perhaps God is one being and then God is three beings, that is a contradiction. But what we say is God is one being and three persons. That is not a contradiction. It might be difficult to wrap your head around, and then you can move through and explain the Trinity biblically. But as you see, it falls into the logic category, or depending on how the conversation is going and how you've gathered your evidence with your Columbo questions, maybe you've realized that it would be better to move this into the morality area. So, oh, well, you say you don't believe it because it's a contradiction. Well, why is that wrong? Because if this individual is a relativist, then who cares about contradictions? It doesn't mean anything, right? Or if the person is a materialist, a naturalist, and everything is just a contradiction, wouldn't be a problem because it's all biochemically determined by the laws of physics. And any sort of contradiction is just sort of an illusion that we plaster on our determined behavior and beliefs. Right, so in either sense, you know where it falls on the Plinko board and you're able to answer it. Or if someone says, well, look, science has disproved God. Well, you'd want to ask, okay, well, hold on, what do you mean by that? What's science? Or what experiment has been done to disprove the existence of God? Because, of course, no experiment has been done for that, right? We know that science itself came from the presuppositions of the Christian worldview, and science continues to operate with assumptions that only can be explained by the Christian worldview. So, in regardless of how you want to take that, you already know which category it falls into, and you're able to then build on that idea. And this, interestingly, this Plinko thing, you can run it the other way up from the bottom up as well, because your categories can then have arguments based on top of them, right? We talked last week about the cosmological argument. So that can be stacked on top of your logic category, and that argument is basically anything that begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. And typically what's used here is that the universe began to exist, therefore the universe needs a cause. And then you start thinking of, well, how do you describe this cause? Well, it has to be incredibly powerful if it was to cause the universe, and it has to be spaceless and timeless because space and time are part of the universe and which was created, and it must be personal because there must be a reason for creation, and personhood and personalities invested in the creation, and that has to have a source, right? So you can keep kind of going back and you start going, well, that kind of sounds like God, right? That's what we would say God is, right? And you can perhaps look into the design, the fine tuning of the universe, whether you're looking at the cosmological constant, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and all of these different things, right? It had to be extraordinarily fine tuned such that we have the universe we have life, the life permitting range of a ton of constants makes it extremely improbable that any of this could have happened by chance. And a couple notes. If you look on the very end of the worksheet, you'll see a big old resource list. Since we're talking about design, there's a bunch of different books there. The easiest one, I would say, is that first one, The Understanding Intelligent Design, Everything You Need to Know in Plain Language by William Dembski and Sean McDowell. In there, Dembski has developed kind of like a flow chart for how to determine if something is designed or if it's come about by chance. And as someone who is a novice in terms of science, I think it's convincing and it's pretty easy to understand. He talks about he talks about a number of things from up at the level of universe and the fine tuning of all the constants in the universe that we talked about, or all the way down to the molecular level and the design and complexity of different things. But also, there's that first book, The Controversy of the Ages by Ted Cable. Now, the thrust of that book is that Christians should not be splitting and dividing over differences of opinion on how old the Earth is. And he's an old Earth creationist, and I'm a young Earth creationist. But I think in terms of like how people should be relating to one another and what they should and shouldn't be splitting over and how to act as Christians that he points to in that book, I think are very commendable. Also, there's a section in there that he does a historical overview of this idea, this myth that is very much still around today, but kind of came about through the Enlightenment. The myth that science and religion in general, and Christianity in particular, are always attacking one another. Now, it's very wrong, but people think that's the way it is. So he kind of goes through and shows how that's false, and he does all of the classic examples, the Galileo and the church, or a more modern example of the Scopes trial or something, right? So he goes through, and I think that section is worth the price of admission. It's not a very expensive book. It's not a very long book, so I would commend that to you. Also, to go back to our Plinko board, you can stack the moral argument on top of your moral category. And so that argument is basically saying, look, objective morality is a thing. It exists. It's not simply an illusion because we're trying to get society to work on top of our determined ways. And it's not something which is entirely dependent on socioeconomic categories of people. That it is in fact objective to humans, so that there are things that apply throughout time and place. And that, because it's objective, points to the objective existing God who is able to ground morality because he has revealed things about his nature to us. So you can stack different arguments on top of those categories to help make your case, but what you will use when and how is determined by the individual you're talking to. What it is they are valuing most, and you're showing how Christianity can take that into consideration, take that into account. And I also included And next, a quote from this guy named Thomas Nagel. He is an atheist, or at least agnostic, philosopher who's very sharp and is probably the most honest of the people we've been quoting that are non-believers. I mean, Rorty got there eventually with his, I'm a freeloading atheist, but Nagel goes further. So he's talking about Darwinism and the problems in it, and how theism in general would explain the problems, but why he still won't believe that God exists. He says, I want atheism to be true. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. The root is a fear of religion itself, a cosmic authority problem. And, so someone goes, okay, well, you don't want to do that. What alternative does he give us? He says, my aim is to present the problem rather than to propose a solution. That's fascinating. Like, on the one hand, you're going, thank you for being honest. But on the other hand, you're going, what? How on earth could you be like, I see these problems, and of all my options in my atheism, there are no good answers here. And then you can look over there and go, yeah, you know what? If God exists, that would really solve all these problems. But man, do I not want that. And so instead of trying to do either of those paths, he just kind of gives up and just goes, yeah, there's a problem. Who knows? And so on the one hand, you're glad he's being honest. On the other hand, you're going, man, that is sad. Right? Because ultimately there is that. We don't want an authority over us. Right? We want to just be able to do what we want to do and call it good. And so finally, we've got Columbo step 3, and that's using questions to make a point. So you're using questions to point out weaknesses or flaws in a belief or worldview. And so this trades off the idea that everyone believes their views are correct. We tend to forget that in conversation, but everyone does think their opinions and their beliefs are correct. Otherwise, they wouldn't believe them, right? So he points out that tolerance right now is a huge thing, right? Tolerance, or inclusion, we might say. And so when someone comes at you and says, hey, you're a Christian, what do you guys don't believe, you guys think that, for example, homosexuality is wrong, right? Why is that? Well, you can kind of front load this. So you would say, well, I can answer that, but first let me ask you a question. Would you say you're a tolerant person? Are you tolerant to viewpoints that are different from yours, or are you someone who only wants their viewpoint to be allowed? Now, of course, most of the time they're going to kind of try and fall all over themselves with showing, no, I am always tolerant. Yes, of course, absolutely. And so that particular question does a couple things for us. It slows their momentum. If they've come out and just like, haha, here's an attack, it slows them down, makes them think about it, and it preempts for when they will inevitably call you intolerant. Because they will, right? As soon as you present something like saying, well, hey, we think Jesus is the only way. The only way to the Father is through the Son, right? And all other views are wrong. And in fact, we believe that if you don't believe that you don't repent and turn to Christ, that you will go to hell. That's a strong position, right? And so they'll be, you are intolerant. But you can be like, well, hold on a minute. You just said that you yourself were tolerant. So help me to understand how if I think I'm right, I'm intolerant. If you think you're right, you're just right. Right? So uh that's helping us in a couple of ways there. So we can say, look, we can be tolerant. We can have serious disagreements, and I would say, look, um, I want your beliefs and your positions to have a seat at the table for when we're discussing this. I also think my beliefs should be on the table for when discussing this, and I don't think we should rule out X, Y, or Z belief um, because we're not if they're already not in agreement with us. See what I'm saying? And so I've taken all of the rest of these from Greg Koukল's Tactics book, and these are just examples of making a point with a question. Um, for example, have you ever considered that if Jesus was wrong about being the only way of salvation, it's really difficult to call him a good man or a prophet or a wise religious teacher? What do you think about that problem? Or, going back to the homosexuality example, and be like, hey, can you clear this up for me? If homosexuality is truly natural, because what they'll say is this is natural, I was made this way, I was born this way, whatever. Say if homosexuality is truly natural, then why did nature give homosexual men bodies designed for reproductive sex with women and then give them desires for sex with men? Why would nature give desires for one type of sex but a body for another? How does that work? Or again, if you're talking to a Mormon and they say, look, can you, they say, they'll tell you, what we want you to do is read the Book of Mormon, pray about it, and ask Heavenly Father. They'll always say that without the article. It's interesting in conversation. It's distracting. You'll notice it, but they'll say, read the book, pray to Heavenly Father, and ask if this is true. And if it is, you'll receive a burning in the bosom and in your heart, and that will allow you to give confirmation that it's true. And so you can ask, okay, well, how does having a burning in the bosom about the Book of Mormon give adequate evidence that this book is from God, when people have similar reasons, a strong internal conviction from God in response to prayer for rejecting it? Right? How does that work? And so you're making the point. What you're trying to say is, that's not a very good reason when other people can say, I have that exact same reason for rejecting it. How does that work? But you're saying it in a way that softens the attack. And then he also lists phrases that can help soften your approach. Again, that you might say, well, I'm not sure I agree with the way you put it. Think about this. Or, well, I wouldn't characterize it that way. Here's what I think may be a better, more accurate way to look at it, and then you tell me what you think. Or, let me suggest an alternative and tell me if you think it's an improvement. If not, you can tell me why you think your option is better. All of these are ways to get at the same idea that we're wanting to present the truth, but we're doing it in a way that engages the person and gets them to think with us, and we are ultimately, you're not just here's an attack and here's a defend, a parry, and then you attack and they defend. It's not really that way. It is, but you're doing it in a conversational way, in a gentle way, using questions that is just overall a better approach. And yeah, that's all I've got. I've got a bunch of different stuff there for resources, and hopefully that's helpful to you. And sorry again for the technology issue that we had this morning with the live feed. You could, I don't know, blame Jeremy. I really have no idea whose fault it was, but hopefully next week we'll have things ready to go, and you will be able to join with us live, but hopefully this is enough to compensate for the lack of technology.